luminous radiance filled the earth with light as the sun set. Soft white clouds absorbed the surrounding colors until they were pink and orange outlined in gold. Strewn upon the ground were the mangled bodies from the battle that had occurred earlier, and yet the carnage of the day was washed away in the beauty of the sunset. Lying prostrate on the ground, a man stretched out his hands, covered in the blood of his brother's captors. He lifted his head, and a vision of the Lord came to him, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." Abram, weak from the day, cried, his tears dampening the ground, asking bitterly, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" As the sun sank beneath the earth, the golden sky melted into a deep blue, and the Lord declared, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who comes from your own body shall be your heir." Abram rose from the ground and looked out to the land. A darkness had fully enveloped the earth, and though the light of the sun was no longer, the wonder of the night was evolving. The Lord said to him, "Look now towards heaven, and count the stars if you were able to number them." Abram lifted his eyes to see the light of heaven, and watched for hours as a countless array of stars began to pierce the darkness. The Lord said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Abram fell once more to the earth, and kissing it, covered the ground in joyous tears. He believed in the Lord, and the Lord accounted it to him for righteousness. "All men by nature desire to know," are the opening words of Aristotle's Metaphysics. This assertion is a great revelation regarding the nature of man. For all men are born with an innate desire to know, to discover the world around them, the reason it exists, and how they are connected to it all. The pursuit of knowledge is mandatory for the discovery of these considerable musings. Many philosophers and seekers of truth have made inquiries into the nature of the metaphysical aspect of knowledge and attempted to determine its goodness. In his book, Paradise Lost, John Milton recounts the fall of Adam and takes up the question of the goodness of knowledge, asking, "One fatal tree there stands of knowledge called, forbidden them to taste, knowledge forbidden? Suspicious reasonless. Why should their Lord envy them that? Can it be sin to know? Can it be death?" Milton tells the story of Adam in the garden, looking up at the tree, wondering why he was not permitted to eat of its fruit. The spark of curiosity in man insisted that it was suspicious that God should envy something of him, and he questioned why God should forbid him to partake of the tree. Surely God should not envy man for desiring knowledge of good and evil, since he himself was the originator of goodness, and he himself possessed knowledge. If man merely wanted to have the knowledge that God had, it certainly could be nothing but a blessing. It surely could not be sin to know. It truly could not be death. Yet, when man desired the taste of that forbidden knowledge, desire conceived and gave birth to sin, and sin brought forth death. The first man who desired knowledge caused the fall of mankind from the presence of God Almighty, suggesting that the possession of knowledge is perhaps the ultimate curse one could bring upon himself. But in contrast, Solomon, the wisest man who lived, claimed the heart of the prudent gets knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge, suggesting that knowledge is perhaps the greatest blessing one could seek after and possess. Man in every age has sought to increase his capacity to know, believing it to be the aim of life. Yet, knowledge seems to be a means by which life is swallowed in sin, resulting in death. All men by nature may indeed desire to know, but if properly understanding God's plan for man, should men in fact desire to know? Abraham would often awake before his wife Sarah and young son Isaac to go outside the tent to pray alone. He would look up to see the light of the rising sun pierce the darkness of the night and witness the long shadows shrinking back and retreating until they disappeared. He would kneel to pray and listen for the voice of God. Many times God called Abraham by name, and earnestly he would reply, "Here I am." Abraham reflected on how less than a decade prior, he had a different name and a different legacy. When he was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Abraham smiled as he remembered the covenant he had made with God, that he would become the father of many nations. Abraham reflected the light of the Lord by living with such great faith that even when he did not know or understand what God was doing, he remained steadfast in keeping his covenant with him. It is believed that Adam and Eve willingly exchanged their life for death, their innocent oblivion for knowledge of good and evil, but their innocence did not include absence of knowledge at all. Knowledge was given to man in his perfect state, and it can be easily seen that knowledge itself was originally good, but later was perverted to understand evil. The actual rebellion of eating the forbidden fruit consisted not only in the physical partaking, but in the cognitive decision to partake. The moment in which man knew he would eat the fruit was when he sinned, because, as St. Augustine wrote, the power to act and the will itself are the same, and the very act of willing is actually to do the deed. Man committed a treason against heaven because he was commanded not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and his ability to will became his ability to act upon that will. Man was told by God which tree was life-giving and which brought forth death. If there was no previous knowledge of which tree was forbidden, man could have accidentally chosen the wrong one and could not have been blamed for choosing to eat it. Man intentionally chose to disobey, knowing he was rebelling against God's command. If man had a memory to recall which tree was permitted and which tree was banned, man must have possessed knowledge. Because as defined, memory seems to be a source of knowledge. Man is able to remember experiences and events which are not happening currently, so memory differs from perception. Socrates speaks of perception in a similar manner in a dialogue with Theaetetus, asking him, neither perception nor true belief, nor the addition of an account to true belief can be knowledge. To which Theaetetus replies, apparently not. The decision made by Adam and Eve was neither accidental nor rooted in false perception. The ability to remember what they had been told by God and purposefully rebel demonstrates that Adam and Eve possessed memory, which is a characteristic of knowledge. Man was created with the capacity to know, that he might have the ability to see and understand the light, the glory of the Lord in which he lived. Many people tend to believe that man sacrificed perfect ignorance for the knowledge of good and evil. However, the state of innocence in which man was created contained knowledge, for man knew the nature of God. Knowledge is therefore an attribute of goodness that was perverted to be evil, but was intended for good, since it was given to man in his perfect state. The golden sun shone through the leaves on the trees, so that whatever the light touched was bathed in marvelous contrast to that which remained in the shadows. The light was sometimes so wondrous that one might mimic the trees and reach up their arms, that the tips of their fingers might skim the sea of golden warmth. As small patches of light shone through the trees around him, Isaac would look up to heaven and strive for greater knowledge and the illumination it bestowed. He would sit by a small brook at this golden hour, admiring the sun dancing across the water. Abraham would often stand behind him in the sunlight, making shapes with his fingers over his son's head. The shadows of the shapes would appear on the ground in front of Isaac, and he would furrow his brow as he guessed what it was that he was seeing. Then, looking up, he would be able to look directly at the sun itself, and gaze at it without using reflections in water or any other medium, but as it is in itself. Together, Abraham and Isaac tried to understand why the sun glowed, or why the trees grew to such a wondrous height. For hours, Isaac would talk to his father of the wonder of the sky, the wonder of the light shown in the day, and after, he would find it easier to observe the heavenly bodies and the sky itself at night, and look at the light of the moon and stars. Isaac bathed in the light of his growing knowledge as he sought truth in all these objects of creation. As he no longer needed shadows or reflections, he came to know the nature of God by seeing the light in its source. The moment knowledge became a curse was when the absolute desire for something other than God took control of man's being. God desired for his creation to be set apart from the perversion of good, but man was convinced that by knowing what God knew, he would be like God. Man took it into his hands to make himself what he already had in God. St. Augustine addressed Adam's plight, writing, "By craving to be more, man became less. And by aspiring to be self-sufficing, he fell away from him who truly suffices him." In the moment that man believed himself to be self-sufficient, desiring nothing but that fruit, idolatry seized man's heart. When man decided that the only God he needed was knowledge, the beautiful reality of the goodness in which he lived was replaced with the reality of how immense the evil was, and he was ashamed. The purpose of man's capacity to know was given to him that he might know the nature of God and dwell in the contentment that it provided. And Themm beautifully described man's knowledge of God when he said, "It is thou that hast made me, and hast made me anew, and hast bestowed upon me all the blessings I enjoy. And not yet do I know thee. I was created to see thee, and not yet have I done that for which I was made." Man knew that he wanted to be like God, and even be God, but the purpose for which man was made was to know God, and yet he chose to make knowledge itself as God. Man was created to see God, and yet chose to look away. St. Anselm wrote about this very choice, saying, "If you should find yourself in the sight of God, and one said to you, 'Look thither,' and God, on the other hand, should say, 'It is not my will that you should look,' ask your own heart what there is in all existing things that would make it right for you to give that look contrary to the will of God." Contrary to the will of God, Adam heard the voice of another and looked away. Accordingly, men who wish to be the light, not in the Lord, but in themselves, who think the soul's nature is to be that which God is, are those who experience the curse of knowledge. Those who are so enraptured by the intelligence reflected from the mind of God, possessed in merely mortal bodies, believe themselves to be the light, and not the mirrors that reflect he who is the light. The pride of life is manifested when man denies the cause for which he is made. His mind made to know God, his eyes made to see God. Choose to make knowledge itself as God. Early in the morning, the glorious light overtook the valley of the promised land Abraham had settled in. As Abraham walked among the tents of his family and servants, the silence of peace filled his heart with joy. As he walked alone a way off, the Lord called Abraham's name, to which he readily replied, "Here I am." Abraham listened to the Lord with obedience of heart, honoring the covenant he had entered into with God. In the following 4 days of travel, Abraham never let go of his son's hand, though scarce were the words exchanged between them. Abraham would often look down at his possession for which he himself would have gladly died many times, to see him looking back at him, grinning from ear to ear. When they reached Mount Moriah, the mountain loomed before them, and yet the light, peering over the ridge, caused Isaac to run towards it with all his might, laughing in delight and reaching his fingers to the sky. Abraham smiled and gathered the material for the offering, telling his servants to stay behind. Abraham followed Isaac up the mountain, and only once did they pause to rest. Splashing around in a small stream, Isaac suddenly stopped, went to the pile of supplies, picking up the wooden knife. He looked inquisitively at his father. "Look, father, here are our supplies. But where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham looked at Isaac and said softly, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them gathered the wood and walked the rest of the way, hand in hand. Isaac held within himself the knowledge that his son was the heir of the promise that God had made with him, and yet climbed the mountain, leaving one thing behind, taking one thing along. He left behind his worldly understanding, and he took along his faith. The goodness of knowledge appreciated, not as God, but as a good and perfect gift from the Father, is what men should by nature desire. However, there comes a time when knowledge itself is not enough to understand the nature of God. If Abraham had heard from God and only comprehended what God had said, it would not have been cognitively understood why God would demand Isaac as a sacrifice. However, Abraham went up the mountain with the promised one, built the altar, and laid his son upon it. He knew it was God Almighty who was testing him. He knew it was the hardest sacrifice that could be demanded of him. But he also knew that no sacrifice is too severe when God demands it, and he drew the knife. Just as the goodness of knowledge can be idolized, so can the covenants of God be worshipped, instead of he who promised them, when man begins to see them as the sole purpose of living. Abraham had to be willing to give back to God the son that had been given to him. If Abraham had knowledge of God and even loved him, but had not faith, he would have come to the conclusion that God would not desire him to offer the heir of their covenant as a sacrifice. He would have reflected within himself, and instead of placing Isaac before God, would have taken matters into his own hands, basing his decision on what he could comprehend. Kierkegaard wrote about the difference between one who reflects upon his own knowledge and one who relies on faith in God, saying if it had been otherwise with Abraham, he perhaps would not have had faith. For he who loves God without faith reflects upon himself. He who loves God in faith reflects upon God. Had Abraham reasoned in reflection within himself, he would not have been forgotten. He would have saved many by his example, but he still would not have become the father of faith. Abraham stepped into his legacy as the father of faith, not by knowing what God might do, but by holding fast to the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. Many times will man approach God with an expectancy to see what can be known, having a mindset to prove God's nature with logic or with earthly wisdom. Thomas Aquinas wrote a book of proofs that consisted of articles proving the existence of God. In one article, titled Whether the Existence of God is Self-Evident, Aquinas states that a thing can be self-evident in either of two ways. On the one hand, self-evident in itself, though not to us. On the other, self-evident in itself and to us. A proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. He goes on to explain that since God is his own existence, the predicate is included in this, and the predicate and the subject are the same, and the proposition God exists is indeed self-evident in itself. He discusses the essence of God, saying that though not self-evident to us, that which comes from God, namely his effects, self-evident in themselves, are more known to us. This discussion leads to the second article, whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. The reasoning that constitutes a proof for God's existence is admirable, yet virtually perpetual, in that understanding one component will always lead to uncertainty in another. What men do not realize is that the human capacity to know God may very well be limited to a scope of earthly understanding that is but a fraction of who God really is. After devoting their lives to the quest of coming to the knowledge of God and truth by their own might, many men find themselves on their knees, crying in anguish, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," as they realize that human understanding will never truly be sufficient. One who seeks out the truth by use of human knowledge will not realize how truly blind he is, but will proceed forth in the dark, never knowing what it is like to see the light. In the midst of his quest to uncover knowledge regarding his birth and family relations, Oedipus proudly claims his name for all to hear, believing himself to be the riddle solver who is void of no knowledge. However, Tiresias, the blind prophet, recognized that Oedipus was consumed in a life of murk and darkness, and cried out in despair, "How terrible to see the truth when the truth is only penned to him who sees." Blind as he was, Tiresias had eyes to see the light of truth that Oedipus, with physical eyes, could not see. When the truth of Oedipus' birth and marriage was revealed, it was so unbearable to live with that Oedipus gouged his eyes out that he might never again see the light that truth provided. His physical blindness became an outward demonstration of the lack of sight he had always possessed. As he was being led into exile, the chorus mourned Oedipus, saying, "Pitiful, you suffer so. You understand so much. I wish you had never known." Revelation of his own ignorance brought the destruction of Oedipus because the foundation of his life was false knowledge. Another man who built his life on the foundation of knowledge was Socrates. The oracle at Delphi prophesied that he was the wisest man who ever lived. After learning of this prophecy, Socrates took up the task of questioning the people in the world around him what it was they knew, that he might come to know as much as he could. Socrates spent his days in pursuit of truth, inquiring of all the wise men of his time what it was that they knew. Many times he left his dialogues with resentment and began to determine that no one knew what they claimed to know. He fulfilled the oracle's prophecy, not by possessing an abundance of knowledge, but rather by understanding within himself, Anita oti Ida. I know one thing, that I know nothing. The lives of Oedipus and Socrates, and the proofs of Thomas Aquinas, demonstrate the insufficiency of earthly knowledge men possess, and how pursuing with the use of one's mind the nature of God and truth becomes nothing more than grasping for the wind. To understand the nature of the things of God, one must understand that he cannot understand. One must come to know that he cannot know. Man must regard his lack of humility and approach God, not with methods on how he can be proved, but with a heart ready to believe in what he cannot see. Abraham and Isaac ran down the mountain, singing praises to God. The servants were waiting at the bottom expectantly, and as the father and son approached, called out an inquiry about the sacrifice. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, Abraham shouted to them in exultation. The servants marveled at this. Indeed, the marvel has never truly subsided, and throughout history, men have desired to understand the paradox that the story of Abraham so greatly embodies. Men have perpetually questioned the goodness of knowledge, tracing it back to its origins. They have resolved that since knowledge was created by God, it must be good, yet can be perverted to understand evil. By understanding this, man has made knowledge his God, rather than the God who made knowledge, contradicting Euclid's definition that the part is not greater than the whole. Striving to understand the nature of God, man goes so far as to construct a proof for God's existence, and unable to achieve his goal, falls into despair. The wisest of men have humbly accepted what Socrates discovered and what Paul proclaimed to the Corinthians, that if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. When man reflects upon God, he understands that his innate desire to know is jointly proportional with his innate desire to have faith. It is the natural desire of all men to see the light by which confusion and doubt are eliminated. Men will attempt to satisfy this desire with knowledge alone, devoting their lives to improving their minds, while oblivious to the fact that the light they desire can only be found in the one who created it. The world of men is full of reflections of light, dazzling to gaze at, a wonder to perceive. For this light to be understood, though, man must be able to turn himself around to see not the mere reflections, but the source. This turn is called faith. May all men by nature desire knowledge, but above all, may each man who finds knowledge understand that it must be his desire to have faith. May all men be as willing as Abraham to sacrifice what they know and what they can see for faith in the uncertain, hope for light in the midst of darkness. May each man come to kneel before God with the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi upon his lips. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me correct faith, certain hope and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. May each man in the profundity of his knowledge find himself humbled before the author and finisher of his faith, with arms stretched open, gazing up to heaven, learning each day what it truly means to see the light.
Thank you very much, Ms. Themm. I would like to begin with your quote, not your quote, but your statement regarding Socrates. You said he was a man who built his life on the foundation of knowledge. Now, Socrates does use a great deal of logic in his dialectical method. However, oftentimes at the end of many of his dialogues, it finishes with a story. And do you think Socrates is one who seeks knowledge simply through logic, or does the presence of many myths and stories in his dialogues point towards Socrates actually having a sort of basis in faith or belief in his philosophy?
I think that the overall aim of Socrates is to always reach for this thing that is higher for himself, to get to the point where he could understand what was originally the standards of everything, such as love and justice and knowledge and all these different things that he knew were in the forms. And I think that the use of stories made it easier for his companions to be able to follow along while he was dialoguing with them, and that he would include them perhaps to make a real-life situation, make his high and lofty thoughts applicable in a way that people could actually understand. But I think that the knowledge that he built it on was that there was always something to keep striving after, and that since he built his life on this, knowing that prophecy that had been over him, he was always trying to reach that goal of being the wisest man, whatever that meant for him.
Mm-hmm. A big part of the engine that propels Socrates' quest for knowledge is the dialectical method. basically two people sitting down, asking each other questions, examining thoughts, bringing them up against each other. In your vision of the accumulation of Christian knowledge, how far do you think that the dialectical method is an important part?
I believe that there are many beautiful things that we need to consider, that God gave us intelligence for a reason. He gave us our minds. God originally gave us knowledge in the first place that we might come to know Him. And so when that was perverted, we kind of had this veil over our eyes that blocked us out from really actually seeing God anymore. But I think by faith, as 2 Corinthians, that veil can be removed by God, who is liberty. But I think that the quest for knowledge comes about by engaging the people around us, by being able to sit down and having conversations about things that aren't explicit in nature, things that God hasn't written in the clouds to tell us. And as Solomon wrote, get wisdom, get understanding in all you're getting. Get these things, for profits are better than silver and gold. And I think that it is our responsibility as good stewards of our minds to cultivate intelligence, to be able to sit down with people and have a conversation that means something. The dialectic method, I think, is a great way, people going back and asking each other questions to get each other thinking and going up. But at the point where it reaches that climax, that I think that's where that humility factor comes in. Now, I didn't say the argument of I know one thing, I know nothing, to say that we shouldn't even try at all, because I think that's total misuse of that. I believe that all men by nature should desire knowledge, but yet at the end of the day, I think it's okay to be able to say, okay, I don't know everything, and I'm not going to be able to understand everything, and that's okay, because God reveals to me what it is that I need to know for today, that is sufficient for me to be able to come to that place.
Mm-hmm. I think 2nd century Christian church father Tertullian said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" And by that saying that, you have this whole history of Greek thought, all the, astronomy, political science, geometry, and then you have Jerusalem, where in the Bible, it's about God. And you might think of the Bible ultimately culminating in the death of Christ as the center point of all history. And you look at the Bible and you look at this whole Greek tradition, and some people would say, what do they have to do with one another? Now, in your understanding of the way a Christian comes to knowledge, do you think a Christian's pursuit of all these other, what we call the traditional liberal arts, geometry, science, whatever you want to put in there, of that whole kind of tradition of education that you get from the Greeks, how does your understanding of the pursuit of knowledge affect one's interest or disinterest towards that whole Athens tradition?
Okay, so one of the first things you asked was the Athens and Jerusalem. What is the similarity they share? And I think that is people, the people who have lived through different places, growing up in different places, have had different methods poured into them, shaping them to either pursue logic or to pursue faith. But how I believe that as a Christian student, someone who truly pursues knowledge and the desiring to be able to increase oneself, that you may be able to go out in the world and be able to engage with people. Because if you have no ability to go out and be able to talk to people, to engage them in conversations, to be able to discuss with the intellectuals, then really what you have to say about your faith isn't going to really matter to them, because you're never going to be able to could join in conversation with them. So the Christian who pursues education, I would say, is not only for the ability for them to enjoy all that God has given them and to actually steward their minds, but actually is a tool in which they can go out. The final quote that I used, St. Francis of Assisi one, where it says, "Enlighten the darkness of my heart, give me correct faith, certain hope, and knowledge, that I may carry out your holy and true command." So knowledge is, in a sense, this catalyst that allows people to go out, that God's holy and true command may be carried out. Not necessarily that knowledge is the end, but rather that it's a means by which someone can get there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Themm. Other questions?
Aaron.
Yeah, so if knowledge is the pursuit of wisdom in the world and perceiving what you see around you, like the natural world and the mathematics behind it and physics and various virtues in our society, and if faith is sort of perceiving things that are unseen, which is the complete opposite, how do you pursue knowledge without disrespecting, the nature of faith?
I think that faith and knowledge, in a sense, aren't totally polar opposites. I think that what one can reach a point in certain things that you can know, and then there's a point in which there's things that you just have to trust in that. Such as, like, I knew my parents would always take care of me, but I didn't know to what extent they would take care of me. I didn't know if they would be able to provide things for me. I had to be able to trust in this area. Whereas with the knowledge, I always had this understanding that they would. Will you rephrase your question one more time?
Yeah, so I was asking, how do you pursue, for instance, if Socrates was a Christian and, Christianity came before, all the Greek men, Socrates pursuing all of his logic and knowledge, if he only did that, and, if that was the only thing he did, would that be sort of like disrespecting faith? Which, faith is perceiving the things that are unseen and not using our logic and our understanding of the world?
I don't think it would be disrespecting it. I think it would be, I think that he would just be totally missing out on it. Because I don't think by us having faith, I don't think that does anything for faith. Because faith is something that's for us to be able, it's a gift for us to be able to have for when we could no longer reach God with our merely mortal minds. Riley.
That was a really beautiful paper. I really enjoyed it. As one of your examples, you brought up Oedipus, and you talked about how he had this hunger to know and to know the truth about who he was and what his story was. And then it ended up ruining his life. Is there a point at which it is better to be blissfully ignorant? Is there a point at which we should just give up on the search of knowledge or to avoid a certain area, or just is it better not to know in some areas?
That's a good question. I don't think it was necessarily, it was because his life was founded on false knowledge, because everything that he had built his life on said, oh, I am this woman's husband, and I am the father of these children, and I was raised by these people, when in reality, I was a son of the king, and I killed my father, I killed the king, and I married my mother. And because he didn't know that, when everything that he had realized, when he finally came upon the truth, that was correct knowledge. But because he had everything he knew was only false knowledge, that was what ended up destroying him. So I would say the pursuit of knowledge in itself is not something that could bring destruction, unless of course one sees it as the end goal of their life in a prideful manner. But seeking knowledge to get to the truth, I would say is, it's not inherently bad. But for the case of Oedipus, I was trying to prove in this part, just the insufficiency of earthly understanding. That doesn't mean that all understanding is bad, because that is something that we truly should work towards. But in this certain case, just as showing, like, look, there's got to be more than just what we have, because it's not enough. So, Olivia.
All right, Miss Metaphor, tell me about this sun that he's hearing in your narrative.
All right, so I chose a metaphor of light because of Plato's cave and the idea of enlightenment. And actually, I used an exact quote from the Republic when Isaac is looking in the water and he turns around and sees the sun in its source. And the enlightenment comes with knowledge is like a consistent theme we see throughout all of the great books, that with knowledge comes enlightenment, because you know more. And then with other authors, it's, well, truth brings enlightenment. And so what I was trying to show here was that in nature, God reveals himself. But yet there are certain things in nature that knowledge cannot reveal. There's certain parts of darkness where you just have to run up to the mountain, and even though the light is hidden behind the mountain, you still kind of see the light over the ridge, and you just kind of run towards it. And that's that faith that they had, was walking up that mountain together, knowing that there was light on the other side, yet not seeing the light as they were going up at the time. Thank you for asking that. Mr. Perez?
So my question is, if God is the light, and we need to be a reflection of the light, would we not also need to be light itself, because we have God in us as Christians, and where it is like the dark times, rather than the sun being there and it's not always bright and it's the dark times, would we not be like the stars that people will look to? And do we need to, like, can we still search for knowledge when we have God in us already, or should we just be happy with what he's given us already?
That's a good question. So for the first part, being people who reflect the light, as I said, like the mirrors in a way, it comes down to, I think, almost like a humility thing of saying, God, I want to be that which reflects the light in my word and deed and conduct and purity, but also knowing that I myself cannot be the light, because I myself have flaws, and though I may be able to reflect certain qualities of God, there are certain areas that also are flawed. And there was a part that I said something about, let's see if I can remember it, those who desire, oh yes, men who wish to be the light not in the Lord but in themselves. And so I think that I would say that would be the aim of my life, is to be someone who can reflect the light of God, to reflect that truth, to reflect it all back to him. But I would say that when it comes down to this idea that it's me who's reflecting it, then that can set up areas for pride, and that with that comes the fall of that. But yeah, being able, and there was a second part of that question too. Do you remember what the second part of it? Oh, okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I got off the on that first part. Emma.
Great job. That's really interesting. So at the beginning of this paper, and we were talking about creation, and we talked about how Adam had perfect knowledge, but it was incorrupted. So my question is, in heaven, when we get to heaven, will our capacity to have knowledge, will that be the same as it was in Eden, or will it?
I think that our knowledge will be what is sufficient for us to live in peaceful paradise with God. That being, maybe we will know a lot, maybe we won't know anything. But it's going to be sufficient for us because we're going to find contentment in just being there with him. I said at one part, the state of innocence in which man was created contained knowledge, for man knew the nature of God. And I don't necessarily think that man fully knew the nature of God, else he would have been God. But I also, but he knew God's voice, and he knew God's commands. He knew who God was. He knew what was enough for him to be able to live with God until, like, that contentment was ruined by his lust for the knowledge of good and evil. But I think, and I could be totally wrong. I mean, I have no idea. But I think that what we will have once we get there is going to be, I don't even think we're going to care, but I think that we're going to have enough to be able to recognize this is God Almighty who has made me. Michael.
So earlier this week we talked about the importance of questions, and I think Owen talked about dialectic, having discussions and asking questions, and not just having blind faith. So I was wondering, is there a point at which we should just say, I'm going to stop asking questions and just have faith? Or should we always be asking questions?
I think that there comes a point when asking questions can, like with Thomas Aquinas, like, it's so admirable, like, wow, you wrote this entire book that other students are going to be able to learn from, other people who enjoy the pursuit of wisdom. And yet, over and over again, we see the same questions come up. Can it be demonstrated God exists? Can it be proven God exists? Can it be shown God exists? Because there's, even in the way he does it, and I know that's not the dialectic method, but in the different methods, there's always this part, and as we saw in Riley's paper, where you just have to know that sometimes you just have to keep questioning, because you're never going to get the answers. But I would take it a step further from that and say that after you keep questioning, there's a point in which you just have to stop. Because if you keep questioning, that doesn't mean be apathetic and stop caring. It means be able to resolve within yourself, I'm not God. I can't understand everything that God has made or has ever created. There's this one Amazon quote that says, "For I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." And that being this way, so that's where I would disagree with Thomas Aquinas. Seeking to understand, like, is faith more like marriage or geometry proof? Being able to, do you have to first be able to understand everything, and then because you understand it, believe? Or do you have to first come to it and say, okay, I believe, now I'm going to be able to ask questions like, okay, now how do I model my life after this? How do I represent God in the way I live? And being able to ask that question, believe first, understanding, or vice versa, I think is what it comes down to. Evangeline.
So, is there ever a point when searching for knowledge or coming to knowledge can lead you to knowledge of God, or can lead you to faith, or do you always have to go through faith to knowledge?
I think that different conversions, it's always fun to hear different stories about how different people can do different things, because some people will have searched their entire lives, being brought up in the church and always being brought up in faith, and then after having, like, being brought up in faith, they come to know faith on their own, or they come to the desire of wanting to seek knowledge. And then there's other people who are seeking knowledge as, okay, how can I know God? Who is this God? I'm pagan. What is, like, the pagans we read, they're constantly seeking for something higher than themselves because they know something's out there, they just don't know what it is. And so in that way, knowledge can be the catalyst by which people come to faith. I think that every single story is a little bit different because everyone has different preconceived ideas in their head, and everyone has different ways that they would know they believed if this proved it, kind of thing. So I think that knowledge and faith can both lead to knowledge, or lead to faith, or just one or the other.
And in that sort of the pagans, in the same way the pagans use knowledge to search for truth, and Christians, use faith to come to a knowledge of God. In a sense, can those two overlap, where searching for knowledge and searching for the knowledge of God have points that coincide, or are they always disparate?
I think searching for knowledge is about the world around us. Knowledge is even down to the most finite thing. Knowledge of atoms or of math equations or anything that can possibly be known. It all comes down to, well, where did it come from? And how, the more you try to know something, the more you want to know its source. And so the more you want to know God, that is knowing the source in itself. What did you ask again?
Does knowledge and knowledge of God have points that overlap?
Okay, so yeah, I would say general knowledge and knowledge of God, that I think they do coincide because of the different way we just interact, the way we live, the things we desire to know, all are ultimately from the hand of God.
Nicely done. Now, near the end of your paper, you speak of faith as a term, and I assume like a term from simply seeking knowledge, seeking the source. It's an interesting term because we usually, sometimes we speak of faith as a belief. And so, are those just two different ways of expressing the same thing, or is there something really different about turning around as opposed to taking a leap?
I think that there are a great deal of ways that we could express faith, such as Kierkegaard. Faith is a passion, and we see this passion laid out from the story of Abraham and Isaac. But faith is also a leap. Faith is something that you have to initiate, that you have to be able to do in and of yourself, trusting that on the other side of the chasm, there's something to hold you. And faith is also a race. We see in the Bible, faith is something that is constantly, you have to strive towards something. It's not just this moment of, oh, and now I have faith. It's, okay, and after you've been brought through the fire and you're still standing. And so in this particular part, I talk about this, bringing this light metaphor all the way kind of woven through the end. I talk about how this world that we live in is basically a reflection. It's kind of a Platonic thing, trying to weave it back to that idea still, of this. It's the glory of God that we see around us, but yet it's not as full as the complete glory of God that we will see on the other side of the veil. And so this term that I'm talking about is for basically this, what we see here, we can understand. But what is going to be up there, it has to be this turn of faith, saying I'm not going to understand it now, but I understand that later on. I may understand it. And so that was kind of where I was going with that, was as faith as like a turn away from seeing what you could look at, and look at all these mirrors and being able to look God in the eye and see that as truth and light in itself. Mr. H.
Yeah, you speak kind of faith as being this sort of turning in the face of what appears to be incomprehensible. I was thinking if we applied that same definition of faith to geometry, we might not have gotten nearly so far. You come to the point where something appears truly incomprehensible. The Pythagoreans thought that the diagonal of the square and the incommensurable ratio between the diagonal of the square and its side was just a scandal, and yet we kind of pushed through that issue, and now we understand the square root of 2 and you know what that really means. In the matters of faith, do you think that there's times in matters of faith when faith is not turning away from understanding, but the vigor of faith is shown in our continuance to pursue understanding.
I think that I think it comes down to not this sense of just looking at things, looking at the face of the impossible, and determining whether or not we can figure it out, and therefore trying to. It's this idea of obedience, and I think that with God, knowing the nature of God is different than knowing geometry and knowing the world around us. And so, actually, going back to Evangeline's question, I do think that knowing God and just knowledge on its own can have separate points. Because I think that knowing God and coming to knowledge in God also involves obedience. And that being as his children who love him, or rather are loved by him, there are certain things that we just have to honor our Father, that we can't try. I think it's the greatest thing when new theories are discovered and different locations are discovered, because that's something that was given to us on this earth. Geometry and music and art and beautiful things that people bring together and assemble as reflections of the beauty of God and the light that he's given us. But when it comes to certain things that he's commanded us, I think that by asking questions, we almost disrespect him in a way, because that says we're trying to understand you, and yeah, we know it's impossible, but we still want to try to figure it out as much as we can, rather than being subservient and saying, okay, your kingdom come, your will be done.
Thank you very much.
Mr. McDonald.
Hey, great job right here, people, McKenna. My question is, looking at like the cave, Plato's cave, they see the shadows, they don't see the light. And in your paper you talked about, I think, Abraham and Isaac. I wasn't following along on the paper, just listening. I think that they stare at the sun, they stare at the light. So my question is, do we see the light when we get to heaven, or do we see glimpses of it now on earth? Or do we come to see the light like in part on earth? Or can we fully see it on earth? What is that?
I mean, Christ incarnate was God on earth, the full glory of God actually walking on earth. And I believe that that was the full glory of God, though man with human eyes wasn't necessarily able to see it or understand it. And that's actually one of my favorite quotes, was that I was created to see thee, and not yet have I done that for which I was made. Because maybe we are able to see the full glory of God. Maybe God has actually revealed it here, but our eyes created to see them just haven't done that for which they were made. And that when we're perfected, we actually will be able to. But I would say that as we are on the earth, that we just see glimpses of it, that we see not shadows, but just not the fullness, because I don't think that we would be able to actually live after seeing that, just still in merely human bodies.
Thank you very much, Ms. Themm. All right, could I get all of you please to hand in the choir books to the center, and Melissa Lee will collect them. And there was something I was supposed to tell you guys. All right, but while we're doing that, let's go ahead and say What is the word? N-R-E, in or logos? All right, very good. Okay, once again, younger siblings, please make sure that you go through with your family, with your mom and dad.